Europe, 1919. The old world had collapsed. Empires lay in ruins. Millions were dead. Revolution was in the air. In Moscow, the Bolsheviks streamed that history itself was on their side. To them, the seizure of power in October 1917 was only the beginning. They were counting on a swift worldwide communist uprising. From this dream emerged one of the most powerful international organizations in modern history, the Communist International, or the Comintern, the progenitor of the hybrid war waged by the modern Kremlin. Its mission was determined by the Bolshevik elite's modified imperialism, destabilization of developed countries, the spread of revolution through Soviet expansion, the destruction of capitalism, and the building of a global communist order. But within a decade, the dream of international revolution would take a darker turn, transforming into dictatorial imperialism, political purges, indiscriminate terror, mass deportations, false flag military interventions, and alliances with mortal enemies. At the center of it all stood one man, Joseph Stalin. The communist dictator with the characteristics of a modified emperor, whom modern Russian propaganda calls the Great Manager. The Communist International was founded in March 1919. Its leaders believed Europe stood on the brink of total revolution. Germany was unstable. Hungary briefly became communist. Workers' uprisings erupted across the continent. In its early years, the Communist International served as the headquarters of world revolution. It coordinated communist movements across Europe, funded uprisings, sent agents abroad and encouraged insurrection. But the revolutions failed. Germany, Italy and France did not become communist. The uprisings were crushed. The Bolsheviks were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Europe was not collapsing into revolution. And the Soviet Union was alone. By the late 1920s, Joseph Stalin, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR, had consolidated his power within the Soviet Union through repression. Under Stalin, the Communist International changed fundamentally. Priority was given to the interests of the Soviet Union and to Stalin himself. The Communist International underwent what was called Bolshevization. Decision-making became centralized. Foreign communist parties lost their independence. Moscow dictated policy, and dissent became dangerous. On the 19th of December 1928, Stalin delivered a speech at the plenum of the Executive Committee of the Communist International on the Communist Party of Germany, the so-called German question. The subject was Germany, but the consequences would affect the entire continent. Stalin stated that social democracy and fascism are not antithetical. They are twins. According to Stalin, moderate socialist parties were no different from fascists. This became known as the doctrine of social fascism. Communists were forbidden from cooperating with social democrats. To Moscow, the real enemy was not only Adolf Hitler. The enemy was anyone who opposed the Communist Party. The consequences were disastrous. Never before had Stalin's policies been so catastrophic for all of Europe. Acting on the Comintern's instructions, the German Communist Party, led by Ernst Thälmann, devoted much of its energy not to defeating the Nazis but to attacking the Social Democrats. The German left was divided, fighting among itself and paralyzed. Hitler watched closely. In one of the most shocking episodes of the Weimar Republic, Communists and National Socialists both supported a referendum aimed at weakening the Social Democratic-led Prussian government. Though ideological enemies, they shared a common target: democracy itself. For Stalin, Hitler's rise to power and the militarization of Nazi Germany posed a direct threat. By then, however, the Communist International's policies had already destroyed the possibility of a united anti-fascist resistance in Germany. The actions of the Communist International, led by Stalin, were largely responsible for Hitler's victory in Germany. By the end of the 1930s, Stalin feared that Germany's military power was being strengthened. In April 1939, the Soviet Union entered negotiations with Britain and France to create a collective security alliance against Hitler. For months, diplomats negotiated in Moscow. But mistrust poisoned the talks. Stalin distrusted the West. Britain and France distrusted Stalin. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was extremely reluctant to cooperate with the Soviet Union. At the same time, another diplomatic offer arrived from Berlin for the Soviet Union. Nazi Germany proposed the German-Soviet Commercial Agreement. Secret negotiations with Germany accelerated. On the 21st of August 1939, talks with Britain and France collapsed. 2 days later, the world changed. On the 23rd of August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Officially, it was the Non-Aggression Treaty. Unofficially, it was the partition of Eastern Europe. Hidden within the pact was a secret protocol, under which Poland was divided between the Soviet Union and Germany. The Baltic States, Finland and Bessarabia fell into the Soviet sphere of influence. Without consultation and without consent, Europe's fate had been decided by two dictators behind closed doors. 7 days after the pact was signed, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. Then, on the 17th of September, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. Stalin claimed he was protecting Ukrainians and Belarusians. In reality, the Soviet Union followed the old imperialist policy of expansion, which was assisted by the secret protocol of the pact. At the end of September, Germany and the Soviet Union established a new border under the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty. Lithuania was transferred into the Soviet sphere of influence. The partition of Eastern Europe continued. On the 30th of November 1939, Soviet troops invaded Finland during the Winter War. The Kremlin expected a quick victory, but did not take into account the Finns' desire for independence, and encountered fierce resistance. Stalin intended not merely to seize parts of Finland's territory, but also to annex it. To legitimize the invasion, Moscow created a puppet government, known as the Finnish Democratic Republic, also known as the Teriyaki government. But the Finnish army fought back with astonishing determination. For more than 2 months, Finnish forces inflicted devastating losses on the superior forces of the Red Army. Enormous casualties led Moscow to reduce its ambitions. In March 1940, the war ended with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland survived, but at the cost of forced territorial losses. Nevertheless, the Finnish army damaged the Soviet Union's international reputation. While Europe focused on the wider war with Germany, Stalin continued the imperial policy of expansion. The goal was the Baltic States, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. In late 1939, the Soviet Union forced all 3 countries to sign mutual assistance treaties. Officially, the agreements respected sovereignty. In reality, they opened the door to occupation. In June 1940, Moscow accused all the Baltic states of conspiracy against the Soviet Union. Ultimatums followed. The Baltic governments faced an impossible choice. Resistance meant certain destruction. Submission meant occupation. They capitulated. Unfortunately, they failed to fully foresee the catastrophic consequences of their capitulation. Soviet forces entered all 3 countries. The annexation had begun. What followed was Sovietization. Independent institutions were dismantled. Political parties, except the Communist Party, were eliminated. The press was censored. Soviet police, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, known as NKVD, imposed fear. Mass arrests, executions, and deportations followed. Churches were nationalized. Religious education was banned. Clergy were arrested. The Baltic States ceased to exist. Soviet expansion also continued in the south. The Soviet Union occupied and annexed Bessarabia and Northern Bukovina, both of which were territories of the Kingdom of Romania. As in the Baltic States, Sovietization followed, including political repression, nationalization, deportations, and total control. The borders of Eastern Europe were being redrawn through force. Between May and June 1941, Soviet authorities launched one of the largest deportation campaigns in Eastern Europe. Tens of thousands of people were arrested and deported from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Western Belarus, Western Ukraine, and Moldova. These became known as the June deportations. The deportations served multiple purposes, including eliminating political opposition, reshaping demographics, and providing slaves for forced labor in the Gulag system. Families were loaded into overcrowded freight trains. Conditions were horrific. Many died before reaching their destinations. For survivors, exile often meant years of hunger, isolation, and fear. Deportations, Sovietization and Russification radically changed the demographic structure of the Baltic region. Large numbers of Soviet migrants moved to Estonia and Latvia, where they took over the jobs and housing left by the deported. By 1989, ethnic Estonians accounted for only 61.5% of Estonia's population. In Latvia, ethnic Latvians had fallen to just over half the population. Currently, this demographic situation is being actively used by the Kremlin to destabilize the former Soviet Baltic states by exaggerating concerns about the communities of former Soviet migrants. Among the children of deportees, the Soviet Union promoted the creation of a new identity, the new Soviet man. The aim was to build a national society loyal to Moscow and subordinate to the Communist Party. Much later, when the children of the deportees grew up under the total surveillance of the political police and the pervasive propaganda, and became loyal communists, the Kremlin sent some of them as Communist Party elites to the countries from which their parents had been deported. Many children of the deportees, who failed to rise to the level of the party elite, adopted the identity Homo Sovieticus, characterized by collectivism, cynicism, a lack of initiative and individuality, low empathy, and a widespread distrust of political participation. Upon returning to their countries, they mixed with Russian migrants of the same mentality and had a negative impact on their surroundings. The Soviet Union never acknowledged that the Baltic states had been annexed through military conquest. The modern Kremlin continues the Soviet Union's tradition and asserts that the Baltic states joined the Soviet Union legally and voluntarily. Russian school textbooks described the events as socialist revolutions. In Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, however, the period is remembered differently, as an occupation, as repression, as a national tragedy. The Communist International had begun with dreams of global revolution. But under Stalin, ideology merged with a modified form of imperial power, and the consequences reshaped Europe. The split of German left-wing parties on Stalin's orders helped clear the path to Nazi rule. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact enabled the Second World War and the destruction of Poland. The occupations of the Baltic states and Eastern Europe brought repression, deportation, and demographic transformation. Millions lived in fear. Many did not survive. And even now, decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, the fight against modified imperialism, the legacy of Stalin, continues.